think a little bit about leadership, and let me just begin by introducing Dan. Most of you know him, but Dan has really served our country and the world for decades in a number of different roles. Dan served as a member of Congress from Kansas for 18 years. He served in the Clinton administration as Secretary of Agriculture and as chairman of the Motion Picture Association, where he was able to revel in his true love, which is movies, one of his true loves. And Dan is a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Center in Washington, D.C. And most importantly, he is really a leading voice and in many ways the conscience for all of us on all matters related to food security, hunger, agriculture, and nutrition in the US and the world. And Dan, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing some of your thoughts on this interesting moment that we're in.
Oh, thank you, Peggy. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Great, great. So Dan, you have been around the block, as they say. You've been at the center of US politics through many, many administrations and crises and challenges, but perhaps none are like this moment that we're in right now. So Dan, tell us what is happening in Washington right now and what is happening in the US, and what are your thoughts on leadership at this moment, lack of it, or where we're seeing it emerging?
2020 reminds me of the Dickens quote, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times," except this year, it was almost all the worst of times. You know, you think about it with COVID and the pandemic, and of course, all the election toxicity in American politics. And now you see so many people hurting as a result of all of these things, and lines to get food, and what's happening to the economic situation. And you know, so it's not been a very good year. The positive sign, of course, we have a vaccine coming, and I'm always optimistic about the future in this country. But you know, we've been through a tough time, and part of it has been an absence of leadership at the executive branch and even at the congressional level. Well, you know, what is a president supposed to do? He's supposed to provide the kind of character and ideology that gets people to not only feel good about themselves, but to move forward and do things that they need to do in order to make society function better. And it's been really tight, and I don't want to overdo this from a partisan level, but the president has been the leader of the worst magnitude. He's pulled out all the worst aspects of many of us, and it's made life a lot more difficult for most Americans, because leadership requires persuading people to do things that they may not want to do but should do. Leadership requires bringing out the best of people. Leadership requires consensus and collaboration, and a lot of the values we teach at the Aspen Institute. And it's just been a really tough period of time, and then magnified by this asteroid that's hit the earth of COVID. And we weren't prepared for it as a country. And if you don't have good leadership, boy, I tell you, you're really in a heck of a lot of trouble. So saying all of that, I think we start 2021 in hopefully a better position than we're ending 2020.
Mm-hmm. So Dan, you're in an interesting position, really coming from the Midwest, from Kansas, and then being in Washington for so long. Right now, those appear to be polar opposites. There's rural America and what we're experiencing right now, and then this sort of crazy place of Washington right now. What can you reflect on from your role in Washington and from your role in Kansas?
Dorothy said in The Wizard of Oz, Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas any longer. And actually, almost every day I wake up and I think about that quote. That where am I? I'm in Kansas or I'm in Washington? Only because Kansas was my place that kind of grounded me. And I think it helped me in terms of how I deal with the world, how I adapt to situations. And it reminds me of my family, which was basically a nice, loving family, and a less complicated time in life. And, you know, Washington is not Kansas by any stretch of the imagination. But, you know, I always found that when I came to Washington and I met all these members of Congress and worked on public policy issues, that, you know, by and large, I found that most people were talented, creative, had pretty good character. There were some bad apples, but there were more good apples than bad apples. The media was less invasive. We didn't have social media. You know, the living was just a lot easier. And I don't know if I'm just nostalgic or what, because not everything was better back then. Certainly, I mean, race relations was pretty bad back then. Women were secondary back then, back in the 1970s and even the early 80s. But by and large, it was easier to cope with the stresses of life. And I think that's the big change that we've seen in the last 30 years is that we're just in chaos all the time.
Yeah.
And I think most people feel that.
I think you've written a lot about this question of leadership, and we've never felt it so acutely missing right now. But can you reflect, having worked across the aisle, on what many of us are trying to figure out in terms of why the Republican Party has seemed to abdicate their own leadership as public servants, and what your insights are about that, knowing a lot of these people who are involved in Congress right now?
That's a very good question. Bipartisanship has kind of been the foundation of our country since its founding. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have partisanship, but I like to say it's constructive partisanship. So people can have their own views, but when the rubber hits the road, as we talked about before, by and large, people learn how to work together. So if you have a natural disaster or a war or a catastrophe or a pandemic, you work together to get things done. And that's been the great strength of America. And that's being challenged right now. It's a lot more difficult to work across the aisle. And I would say that you're right, for whatever reason, both parties are imperfect, by the way. And the Democrats have the left, which can be pretty extreme too. But the Republicans have, in recent years, proven to be not very prone to compromise, and also not very prone to work issues out in a constructive way for the public as a whole. And the latest example is a situation where half the Republicans in the House signed a letter supporting this lawsuit by the state of Texas to basically remove the electoral process from 4 other states apart from Texas because Donald Trump wanted them to do so. That was certainly not the Republican Party I knew of. We had great Republicans. Bob Dole, Nancy Kassebaum in Kansas. Dwight Eisenhower was a great Republican. Even Richard Nixon, who I didn't like very much, was a constructive policy guy. People forget he created the EPA. We had wage and price controls. I mean, it was a whole different world than we have now. And I think that's hurt our country a lot, is this failure to reach across the aisle to seek common ground solutions.
So let's look ahead to January 20th, 2021. Thank the Lord, we're going to go into a new year. So what can we expect from the Biden administration? And what are your thoughts about what kind of leadership is going to be needed going into 2021, and what the new administration has evidenced to date in terms of their appointments?
Well, I think that you're going to see steadiness. I don't think Joe Biden is a revolutionary. I think you've seen the people he's appointed, by and large, have been people who are thoughtful, competent, have a long record in public service. It's a more diverse crew than we've seen before, but I don't think his instincts are to go for the jugular every day like our current president does. And of course, the big issue to begin with is this pandemic and getting through COVID and getting people inoculated and trying to deal with the issues surrounding this pandemic, which of course is hunger and the loss of jobs and those kinds of issues. I suspect that's what they're going to work on first. And I think he's going to try his best to do this in a way where he does work across the aisle. But if you look at Congress is as divided as ever. And the numbers in Congress are almost even Steven. The House has the Democrats up by only about 5 votes, 5 members. And the Senate is almost even. It may depend on this Georgia election as to whether the Democrats are able to win both seats. But even if they are, it's 50-50. And the president can't cast the deciding vote. So the president's going to have to work with a very divided Congress, and one historically where the Republicans have not indicated a lot of willingness to work with, let's say, with the president, at least a Democratic president. Only time will tell. We'll see if the President Biden is able to exercise his leadership skills and motivate the American people and encouraging us to work together. I think you're going to see more involvement by the corporate world and the nonprofit world and worlds like in Aspen being decision makers. And I think more and more you're going to see, I mean, we need the government to do the right thing, but we can't rely on the government to do a lot of the stuff that we used to be able to rely on them to do it. So it's going to be a real challenge for the new president, but at least he has a temperament which is thoughtful, empathetic, and on the level. And he's not a hostile person. He's a person with high moral character. So I think that is good news for the country.
Right. And Dan, a lot of people have talked about Biden as a healer, the healer in chief, and that is what we need. Having been through COVID, been through Black Lives Matter, civil political unrest, distance between rural America and urban America. Do you think that he is a leader who will be a healer? And do you think that's an appropriate thing to look to a political leader to bring?
I hope so. If you look back in history, our great presidents had certain qualities to them. One is they had some empathy. So Bill Clinton used to say, "I feel your pain." And, I think he did, but even if he didn't, it sounded good and it made people feel better. And certainly Franklin Roosevelt during the midst of the Depression, spoke to the needs of people who are really, who did not have resources to deal with. And so, I hope he can do that, but we've got a lot of divisions in our society. You talked about rural, urban, there's this feeling in rural America that they're left out. And I'm not talking about farms, I mean small towns, that they're not participating in our economic recovery, and that's a real problem. There's the division between races, which we've seen in the last year or two, which has probably been simmering forever and ever and ever. But that's something that he's going to have to try to deal with. But it's not just going to be up to him. It's going to be up to others in society as well to help him and to try to get us to work together and collaborate more than what we've done.
But let's turn to you, Dan. You are a natural leader. You make everyone you encounter really feel great. I've had the pleasure of being in so many meetings with you, and you walk into a room and you really bring the sense of the possible and respect for almost everyone who's there. And this is a very special quality. So I wonder if we could just go a little bit introspective in terms of your own leadership. And if you can share a time when you really felt really proud of something that you did as a leader in any of the roles that you've played.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll tell you the two attributes of leadership, which I think are really important. One was advice from my mother, and ironically also from Senator Dole of Kansas, who once told me, he said, "Glickman, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a simple reason. Don't forget that." Okay, so my mother said it to me in a more motherly way than he did. But the ability to listen is an act of great leadership. And the second thing, which I think is true, is the ability to laugh at yourself. So what I call self-deprecating humor. And if you look back at our presidents who have been extremely successful and who have lasted, most of them have been people with a great sense of humor. So not always I agreed with, but Ronald Reagan had this great sense of humor and timing. Franklin Roosevelt had this wonderful sense of humor. Abraham Lincoln, of course, nobody was funnier than Lincoln. Nobody had more lasting quotes, but the ability to laugh and smile at yourself, it gives you an ability to lead and persuade, which people who don't have that quality, it's really much more difficult for them to and that's where the rural urban thing comes in, because whoever's president has to be able to smile and relate to all people, regardless of where they come from and what their backgrounds are. And sometimes difficult to do that. Now, the last question you ask is there something I remember that leadership, and I mean, that I've made mistakes, and there are areas that I haven't been such a good leader on, and other areas that I did good. But when I came to the Department of Agriculture in 1995, I walked in and there was a group of about 400 African-American farmers, and they were picketing the Department of Agriculture. And I thought to myself, oh, I won't tell you the word I said afterwards, but you can kind of figure it out. And then I said, how am I going to deal with this problem? Because I really didn't know anything about it. And I had to confront the problem of decades of discrimination against African-American farmers and minority employees as well. And I'd been in Congress for 18 years before that on the Agriculture Committee, and we had never even had a hearing once about this issue. And so I got into it, and my staff got into it, and it was a hornet's nest of just years and decades of discrimination against Black farmers involving farm loans and operational difficulties within the department. So I led the effort to try to get it resolved, and it never thought that would be my prime success at the Department of Agriculture. I thought it would be farm programs or food safety or food stamps or you name it. And so I didn't do a perfect job, but I think we did show leadership, which made a difference because I was persistent, and I didn't want on my watch that this issue not get either fixed or improved. And then later, Secretary Vilsack really took the issue and moved it forward. But what I found from that is that sometimes life throws you curveballs, and the question is, what do you do with them? And on this one, I decided I was going to make an opportunity out of this, do my best, be persistent, involve everybody the best I could, and I had the support of President Clinton, of course. And so I'd say that as I look back, I learned a lot about leadership. I learned a lot about character of people. I learned about what goes into decision making that you have to do, and you can't please everybody all the time, which is difficult for a politician because our natural act is to please everybody all the time.
It's so rewarding to see so many young people and new people coming into politics and into leadership roles. What messages would you give them today about how they can be effective leaders walking into such challenging times? What messages might you give?
I've thought about this because I talked to a lot of young people at the Aspen Institute and other places, but there are certain techniques. Number one is listen. Don't think you're right all the time. Try to understand what the other person is going through in life, and not only their belief system, but where they come from. That makes it, and it makes it so that you at least have credibility and can try to influence people. Then the second thing is to be as well read as you can possibly be. I know that's something that everybody talks about, but social media makes it more difficult. After all, I've got this thing right here, and I can read everything on here, but it doesn't count. So if you don't have the personal experiences yourself, you have to do it through books or through other literature or through movies. And unfortunately, we can't see as many as we used to be. And that's the other thing. And then the third thing is, this sounds like I'm an old high school teacher, but learn to articulate the English language in America, and I'm sure it's other languages other places, so you can speak and write in a way that can be persuasive. What I find is that by and large, that makes a big difference in terms of trying to get people to do things with you or for you. And those are kind of three techniques of the trade. And then the final thing, which I mentioned before, is humor. It's missing in action. I've been watching the White House, and I thought to myself, I hate to say this, Donald Trump was the most humorless man I've ever seen in my life. The only humor he used was humor to make fun of other people, to bully other people, to never kind of show his open soul, to open up and kind of say, I'm a human being and I'm not necessarily perfect, and this is something I did that was stupid, and that kind of thing. And I think that kind of makes a big difference. And for that reason, I don't think he's going to be remembered positively in posterity, and I hope not, because he doesn't stand for the kinds of things that I think good people ought to stand for.
Dan, and you are such a breath of fresh air of a true leader in so many ways. And, I can't help thinking of a Kansas cornfield on a warm summer day, and the sun is shining and the air is clear. And this is the kind of leadership that you bring to any room that you're in. And it's what we're all craving right now. So thank you for your service and for this conversation, which has just been fabulous. I really appreciate it, Dan. Thank you so much.
And Peggy, thank you for your leadership, and that you're being such a role model to me, what you've done for women and girls and what you've done for the developing world. it really has made a difference. I'll just close. There's an old Talmudic expression. It goes, if you save one life, you save the entire world. And I think that's a big hallmark of you, and hopefully for me as well.
Thank you so much, Dan.